Hello everyone, it's me again. Welcome back to the Soul Crushing Experience. For those of you who don't know, this is a series I do where I go through my day-by-day progress on a soul crushing tower and go over my experience, enjoyment, and other things. This time, we head out of the atmosphere and into one of the Zone 4 soul crushing towers, Tower of Inevitable Failure. This tower is based on consistency, as well as some trust gameplay, which is why I decided to take on this tower. So, let's get right into it. I started Toif like most other soul crushings I began, with a practice run. Nothing too notable happened during the practice run, and then I began doing every floor in one run, starting with 10. 10 had some really difficult jumps at the beginning, specifically a truss you had to jump off of the corner, and this head hitter that is pretty scary. After that, floor 10 isn't too hard, and it wasn't long until I did it and started floor 9. It was quite easy, but a lot scarier than 10. Some of the jumps seem a lot farther, and are really easy to mess up if you don't have good alignment. So, I would have to be slow on 9. I did 9 in one go much quicker than I thought I would, and then it was down to 8. 8 is probably the hardest floor. There are lots of tricky jumps. First up are these trusses under a wedge. They are like normal truss flicks, but you have to flick out at a 90-degree angle. Then there's this truss, which you shift flick off of and do a really tight wrap. After that, the rest of 8 is pretty easy. It took a bit longer, but I eventually finished floor 8 in one go. Then it was time for 7. Floor 7 is a camera control floor with lots of unnatural wraps and trusses. It is actually my favorite floor because it is super fun once you get consistent at it. The only noteworthy jump is this one where you grab a truss and then climb down to jump off it. After a bit, I was at 6. 6 is kind of a filler floor. Even the hardest jumps of 6 are not really that hard. The most important part of 6 is that I don't rush, because then I would most likely fail it. It wasn't hard, but I still needed to make sure I aligned it right. I ended up doing 6 on my first try. I ended up doing 7 and 8 as well in one run, meaning that I had done 6 to 9 in one run. Then I wanted to do 5. 5 was long and had some really tight wrap jumps. It took a while, but I did 5 in one run and failed really early into 6. Next up was 4, which is also a long floor, but most of the difficulty comes from trusses. There's one truss that is on an angle against the wall that you have to flick around. I was struggling with it for a bit, but eventually started to get it down. The rest of 4 isn't exactly too hard, but it can be failed for sure. Floor 3 is nothing that hard. It is pretty much just a filler floor. It is really short as well, so I wasn't worried about 3. Floor 2 is basically an easier and shorter version of 7. It has some wraps and trusses, but it is a lot easier than the ones on 7. Then it was time to play from the beginning, which I didn't plan to do for long. Floor 1 is probably the most consistent floor after a bit. Every jump becomes second nature after a while. It wasn't long before I had my first floor 2 attempt. I failed pretty close to the end at 2 because I was too far to the left to grab a truss. Another floor 2 attempt after a few minutes of absolute brain rot. I advise you to look away from my chat if you want any of your sanity. I then got to floor 3 this attempt, and failed to flick around the truss. I only fell to 2, and then managed to get back there and past the truss. Then I was up to 4. I ended up getting to the wedge truss on 4, and actually managed to pass it, and ended up fluking the rest of 4. I failed only a few jumps into 5 though, but hey, I wasn't expecting to get here on my first day though, so I was pretty happy with the progress I had. I had my expectations low today, since I knew I was going to struggle on this tower. I was hoping to at least get to 5 today, and that's really about it. I found the skip on 2, but started it by doing a high jump against the wall, rather than wall hopping on the wedge wrap. It wasn't too long before I had my first 4 attempt today. Unfortunately, I failed close to the end of the floor on an easy wraparound. I knew most of my attempts would get to 4 pretty easily, since 1 is kinda hard, but both 2 and 3 are very easy. Speaking of, I got to 4 not too long after that first fail. I failed to grab the truss that is wedged into the wall. Next attempt, got to 4 again. Thanks to the practice I did on the truss, I ended up passing it. I then passed the wrap and got a new PB for today, but ended up missing the truss on the next jump. Another few attempts, and then I got to 4 yet again. Unfortunately, I failed the wedge truss yet again. Another 4 attempt later, and another wedge truss fail. I was really bad at trusses at this point, which is the main reason I was playing ToBK, since I wanted to get better at trusses. After some more practice at the truss, I got to 4 later on. This time, I failed to jump off the truss because my angle was terrible. I realize now that this tower would only get hard once I get to floor 4. Everything up to 9 is quite hard. The 9 and 10 are easier, but still pretty easy to fail if I wasn't careful. 8 is probably the hardest floor in ToBK though, which is mainly because of the shift flick wrap off the truss. Next 4 attempt, I ended up hitting the ceiling trying to wrap onto the truss. I knew 4 was quite a bit harder than the first 3, but it shouldn't be as hard as I was finding it. That was it for today, meaning that I had never passed 4, so unfortunately I didn't reach my goal, which was getting to 5 again today. Despite that, I wasn't really upset at all. I had a fun time playing the tower. I just never managed to get far today. So with that, I had to take a break from ToBK. I was going to see my family for a bit, and would have no time to play the tower during then, so I took an almost week-long break from the tower. I was happy to be back playing ToBK after such a long break. I wasn't sure if I would get to 5 since I had taken such a long break, but I was hoping I would keep most of my consistency. It took a good bit, but I got my first floor 4 run. This first run to 4 now got me to 5. I immediately got a new PB as well. I got past the first structure and got to the moving wraps. I jumped too early on the first wrap, but caught myself halfway through 4. Then I ended up failing past the wedge wrap down to the bottom while trying to get back up to 5. It took a while to get to 4, but my first attempt got me a new PB. Not too long after that fail, I got back to 4, then to 5 again. Approached the moving wraps, and actually got past them. Then I failed the first jump right after them. Then I got back to 4 yet again. This time, the run actually did end to 4, and it was the wedge truss this time. Then, it was time for floor 5 again. I finally got consistent enough at 4 to get to 5 most of the time now. Unfortunately, I failed one of the jumps on the first structure. The thing about floor 5 is it isn't that hard, but a lot of the jumps are very far, meaning if my alignments weren't very good, then I would fail it really easily. After practicing 5, I began to play from the beginning, and after not much longer, I was past the moving wraps on 5 again. This time, I started playing slower and passed my PB. I ended up fluking the hardest wrap on floor 5 and got to the final structure. And then, I got to floor 6. This is where things started to get very scary. 6 is a pretty easy floor, so there is a full possibility I could get to 7. And sure enough, I ended up getting there. 7 was a floor I was going to take super slow. It had a lot of very complicated wraps, meaning I had to have pretty precise camera control. I ended up doing the truss on 7, which I was really scared of failing. And then, I ended up fluking the rest of the floor, meaning it was time for floor 8. This was not going to be easy. First up was the wedge trusses, which I had to flick outwards by a lot. I got past the first one, and then got past the second one. Then, it was time for this truss section. I was pretty bad at it, but somehow fluked it. I got to the shift flick. Unfortunately, I failed it, but then caught myself near the end of 7. Then, I made it back up. So once again, I had to face the wedge trusses. Not really sure how, but I got past them again. Then, I got back to the truss section, and was taking my time again. I got back to the truss flick yet again. I tried a strategy to try it from the right side. I almost made it, but ended up falling all the way down to floor 2. I didn't reset my run and started working my way back up. Somehow, I ended up getting back to 7, meaning I'd passed 5 yet again. Unfortunately, this time, I did fail the truss, and I caught myself at the beginning of 5. I was near the end of 5 on the last structure, and it looked like I was going to get back to 6. Unfortunately though, I walked off stupidly. I practiced on parts, and especially the flick on 8. I ended up getting to 6 again the next run. Unfortunately, trying to jump onto a truss, I hit my head so I couldn't grab it, falling down to the beginning of 5. Then, I fell off of 5, then fell about halfway through 4, which wasn't very far down. Unfortunately, I held A at the top of a truss, then got flung off to the top of floor 1. It took a long while, but eventually I got back up to 5 and passed it, meaning I was back at 6. Unfortunately, I fell near the end of 6 because I didn't get my jump off on the stickout off a truss, but managed to get back to 6 luckily. But then I hit my head again on the truss. My run came to an end after that, unfortunately. This was the last good run I had that day, and decided to end my stream after that. Overall, a really successful day. I got to 8 twice, and finally got more consistent at 4, allowing me to get to the second half of the tower now. The day started with a lot of failing 5. After about 30 minutes, I finally got back to 6. However, I failed to stick out on the truss again, because I jumped too early while focusing on avoiding climbing animation. I caught myself at the beginning of 5, and got back up to 6. With a bit more patience on the stick out, I passed it and got to 7. As per usual with 7, I take my time and go very slow, making sure I am making every jump, and looking to where I jump next, to make sure I remember it. And sure enough, I was back to floor 8. I passed the first set of wedge trusses, but then I turned too quickly trying to pass the stick out, failing to the end of 2. That run ended a bit after that. The next attempt, and I got back there. This time I was more careful on the stick out, passing it, and getting to the truss section. Unfortunately, something changed from last time, and now when I turned, I was too close to the truss, so it didn't let me jump, meaning I was back down to the beginning of 7. Getting back to 8, and this time I failed the first set of wedge trusses. Despite catching myself on 6, I got back to 7 and failed the second jump. The next 8 attempt happened a bit after, and I unfortunately didn't get my jump off on the first set of wedge trusses, meaning I failed them again. And that was my last attempt at 8 of the day. After that, I never got past 5 again, and ended my stream. I was getting very close to completing ToBK now. I just needed to pass 8 again, and make sure I passed the truss flick wrap. The day started strong with my second 5 attempt making it past it, then getting past 6, and 7 as well, meaning I got to 8. However, that run quickly ended to the wedge trusses, yet again, making it my third fail there. Luckily, I only fell to 6, meaning I could get myself back up there if I was lucky. And sure enough, I got back to 8. This time, I passed both sets of wedge trusses, and I was back to the truss section. Now, I made sure to hold the trail mix to push myself off the truss a bit to get my jump. I got back to my PB, but unfortunately I failed it again, but only to the end of 7, so I managed to get back up to 8. I managed to get back to my PB jump yet again, and this time I had finally passed it. Now, the rest of 8, which isn't too hard. And sure enough, I had gotten to 9. These last 2 floors are not very hard, but can be failed for sure. I was hoping I could fluke them, but wasn't really expecting much. The good news is that 8 provides a massive net. Sadly, I failed the ladder flick, but caught myself right back to 9. This time, passing the ladder flick, I was super focused for the rest of the floor. Then, it was time for the final floor. 10 started with some really scary wraps, then some quite hard trusses, as well as a really scary head hitter. The rest of 10 after that isn't too hard, so if I could pass the first section of it, then I could actually fluke the tower. I managed to do the wraps, then managed to get past the trusses. Then for the head hitter, I tried lining up, and walked off to the beginning of 9. This run still isn't over, since I am only back to 9, meaning I am still perfectly fine since I am above 8. Taking my time on 9 yet again, and I ended up missing the ladder on 9, failing to the beginning of it again. This part is super easy to loop fail, which makes it even scarier every time you have to do it. Luckily, I made it back to 10 this time. I carefully passed the first wraps again, then attempted to line myself up on the truss jump, and made it. This time, I was more careful lining up the head hitter, and passed it. This could be it. I could easily pass the rest of 10 right here, and knowing that made me more nervous about the rest of it. Despite that, I kept going, and made it to the last 2 wedge wraps, being extremely careful on them. I made sure to do them from the left to provide myself a bigger net. And then...
Oh my god, please! Please! Let's fucking go! Yes! Oh my god! Holy shit! We nailed it! That's what I'm talking about, man!
Although I dropped this tower for being too hard before, the difficulty this time around felt a lot more like what I could do. Personally though, I find this tower harder than thinning layers. I don't think it is by much, but I find it more difficult, mainly because of some of the truss maneuvers you need to make, as well as the camera control required. I thought this tower was pretty enjoyable, especially once I got consistent at 4. Then it got a lot more fun, because I could get farther more often, which was good for trying to pass 8. Well, without further ado, let's start the rankings. When rating a tower, I rate a tower out of 2 categories, gameplay and enjoyment. We will start out with the gameplay as per usual. The gameplay was something I was not very used to, being a more truss heavy and camera control based tower. However, I realized that I absolutely love camera control based towers, and they can be super fun to execute if you are consistent enough. My only problem with this tower is that some floors have massive difficulty spike jumps. There are a couple jumps on 5, a few on 4, and many on 8 as well. Although, it isn't a huge issue, since most towers have jumps that are harder than the rest of the tower usually. So with that, I give the gameplay an 8 out of 10. Now, for my enjoyment. Learning this tower took a lot of time and was rather frustrating at points. Then, constantly failing 4 got a bit annoying as well, since I knew it wasn't a hard floor. Also, 8 being as hard as it was made it really frustrating. Although, once I got to 5 more, it became a lot more fun, as I stated earlier. Despite all that though, I found the tower rather fun at points, especially floor 7, which is one of my favorite parts on any tower. So with all that said, I'm going to give the enjoyment a 5 out of 10, giving Tower of Inevitable Failure a 13 out of 20 overall, which is a pretty decent score. Thank you all so much for watching as usual. Hopefully, I will be able to edit the Bloodthirsty Kinos video a lot faster than this one, and will then begin my way on working towards the Tower of Astronomically Aimless Annoyances. I haven't been playing Soul Crushing Towers for a bit now, to give myself more time for making these videos, since I don't want a huge backlog of videos to edit. Anyway, it is time to get on to my ToBK video, so I will hopefully see you all there.